everybody. Today we're going to talk about the third and final part of this unit, and that's on traversals. So just a quick little review of the other things we've talked about this unit. A list is just a collection of organized items. All right, so here's the list that we dealt with the first lesson. So these are just three different ways to write the same list. So you have where we did the baggies. Remember, these numbers represent, this represents the name of your list. These numbers represent each index, and then these are the elements in the list. So there's 4 elements in the list, and your index values go from 0 to 3. This is using the blocks. So again, there's your name of your list: lunch food, nachos, pizza, soup, stir fry. And if you write it in JavaScript, in the text, same thing. Just remember that any of the words, whether you write it in JavaScript or using the blocks, the words need to be in quotes where the numbers do not. Whoops. The next thing, So lists can contain different types of data, including numbers and strings. And here, again, same thing. It's just using numbers instead of words. The other thing we talked about were loops. And today we're going to work more with loops, but also with traversals. So here's a quick video to watch. And then we'll just talk a little bit about traversals, and that'll be it.
With lists, we can begin to store lots of data, and we can also think about writing code to process that data. For example, a list of the pixels in an image can be processed to change their colors to give the image a unique filtered look. A digital song file is actually just a list of waveform samples and can similarly be processed to apply. We know that computers are great at repeating commands in the form of loops. So when we want to process every item in a list in a similar way, we can use a loop to iterate through every item and take some action with it. Let's look at how we use loops to process lists. First, we can make a while loop to run a specific number of times by using a variable called count. This loop will run 6 times. We also know that lists have numbered indexes starting at 0, and since the variable count stores a number, we can use count as our index into the list. And since count changes every time through the loop, starting at 0 and going up by 1 until 5, this gives us a mechanism for accessing every item in a list. An easy first step when processing lists is to write a loop that prints out all the values in the list to make sure you are seeing everything. Let's do that here. We'll add a console.log statement in the loop and make the loop condition more general, removing the hard-coded value 6 and replacing it with the length of the list. Now, if the list size changes, our loop will still print everything out. Let's run it. This kind of looping structure, one that uses a variable to control the number of times the loop iterates, has 3 basic components to it. Creating and initializing a variable to use as a counter, some condition that checks the value of the counter each time through the loop, increasing the value of the counter by a set number for each iteration. This kind of structure is so common that many languages include the for loop to do just that. The for loop combines these components into a single line of code for convenience. The standard setup of a for loop looks like this. There is a lot going on here, but you can see it has the same basic components as the while loop above. It creates a counter variable called I, while I is less than 4. Add 1 to I every time through the loop. You might read a for loop out loud like this. For variable I starting at 0, while I is less than 4, I++. You can think of I as shorthand for index, and I++ is shorthand for increase the current value of I by 1. The value of I will come in handy when we use it to access each item of the list, just like we use the counter variable in the while loop. Note that I is just a convention and you can name it anything you want. Let's look at an example of using a for loop to go through every item in a list and doing something with each item. Here we have a list of red, green, and blue values for a very small image. We could brighten it up by adding 50 to every number in the list. In each iteration of the loop, we are getting the current value stored in the pixel list at index I, adding 50 to that number, and then updating the value at that same slot in the list to the new value. So the first time through the loop, I is 0, pixels at index I, or pixels at 0, is 28. 28 plus 50 is 78. Pixels at index 0 is updated to be 78. The next time through the loop, I is 1, so pixels at index 1 will be accessed and updated in the same way. This will happen for each item in the list. With a for loop and a list of values, you have an easy way to process all of the items in a list. This is a foundational concept in computer science you will see over and over again, and it unlocks the power of dealing with lots of data.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about traversals. This is the last part of the unit. If you want to know what a value is in a list, just any given list, what would you do? Well, most likely you're going to scan the list and look and see if you can find that item, and that's exactly what the computer does. So when we talk about transversals, you're going through the list, the computer's going through the list one item at a time to find whatever it is you're looking for. So we'll take a look at these examples using a for loop, all right, which we just talked about. You already know the parts. You have your initial value starting at I equals 0. In a lot of these, instead of using I is less than 4, I is less than 10, it's going to say I is less than the list length, because you want to be able to access any value in the list, whether the list is very short or very long, or if it changes. If you just use list.length, it'll check every item. And finally, as you know, it goes up by 1. All right, so basically how this is going to work. Here's your list, 77, 85, 89, 65. So we want to look at the list. Right now, I equals 0. We want to evaluate the statement in the for loop to see what value is stored by the variable's element. So if we're looking for element 0, that's your index. That would be item 77. So basically, it's a way to call certain items, certain elements. So we start at 0 and work our way up. As you go through the list, now we're at element at index 0 is 77. All right. If you wanted to find element 1, remember 0, 1, that would be 85. Now we're looking at element 2, it would be 89, and so on. All right, pretty basic. Now, as it moves up, we don't have an element 4, so you would exit the loop and you'd be all set. You'd be done searching your loop for those items. All right, so basically a traversal is how you're accessing each item in a loop. You're traveling or traversing through a list one element at a time. That's all it is. Basically, we're not really doing anything new. We're just learning ways to scan our lists. So with this same example, this says if element equals 85, then the console.log, which would print at the bottom, would say element found at index and whatever the index value is. Otherwise, we're going to write not found. So if I'm looking for element 85, that's not element 85. So in the console, it would say not here. Here's 85. So down in the console, it would say element found at index 1. But it would continue looking because maybe 85 shows up again. All right, so that's what would show up in the console. You can also find things like the max or the min value. All right, if you were looking for the minimum value, you could reduce your list down just to that item. So if we want to find the smallest number in the list, we can quickly look at it and say, oh, it's 65. But remember, the computer needs to go through one item at a time. All right, so basically it's going to scroll through until it finds it, and it's going to give us 65, and it's at index 4. All right, pretty basic. So just some key takeaways from today. Use a for loop to traverse or travel through the list to find each element one at a time, or visiting each element one at a time until you find what you're looking for. Each pass through the loop, the counting variable changes usually by 1, but you can adjust that. If you want the I to increase by 2 or 3, you can do whatever you want. We can access each element by evaluating the list at that position. So if I wanted to look at the 5th item, I'd look at index 4. Once you know the element at each spot in the list, you can do different things. You can filter it, which means create a subset of elements. Maybe you're just looking for even numbers or odd numbers, and you would create a new list. Or you could reduce it down to one item. For example, the min, which we looked at. All right. And a traversal, again, is just the process of accessing each item in the list one at a time. So you're just taking a peek at each item. All right, so that's it for traversals. We're going to do some practice on code.org in the next task, and then we're going to move on. If you have any questions, stop by the Math Lab. Have a great day.